You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello and welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. I'm delighted today to welcome David Jabbari. David is CEO at conveyancing practice Muve. Today we're going to be talking about your career, David. We're going to be talking about some of your predictions for 2023. And we're also going to be talking about the way in which this market has developed over the years, because I think you bring an interesting insight to proceedings given your background. But I shall let you explain a little bit more about that. Thank you very much indeed for joining the podcast. Tell us a little bit about yourself in the first instance. Tell us about who you are and what you do.
Well, thanks, David. As you say, I'm CEO of Muve. I wasn't a conveyancer by background. My early career was spent in the City of London. I worked for firms like Allen and Overy, for example, for 9 years, and I was the chief executive of a city law firm, Barlow, Lyden, Gilbert, which we merged with Clyde & Co., creating, I think it was the biggest ever merger of two UK law firms at the time. So my background was very much in the commercial legal world, in management in that sphere, but also very much in the legal technology side of the City of London and the interesting things that were being done in that area. And then I made a move out into what you might call consumer law, probably back in about 2012, where I started working for some large national law firms running their consumer law divisions, and then cutting a really long and tedious story short, got to a point in 2015 where it seemed right to start my own venture, which I started with Dan Watkins and Klaus Werner, who had been the creators of Contact Law. And the idea really was to build a kind of composite of volume legal services, but with bringing their very sort of sophisticated legal marketing and lead generation skills together into that entity. And we've grown very, very rapidly. We predict on our own sort of measurement of market share that by end 2024, we would be in the top 5 by volume of sale and purchase conveyancing. Obviously, that's dependent on what goes on in the market, but yeah, that's the kind of trajectory we're on.
You've alluded to your background in consumer legal services, and that's really where I want to start the conversation, because as you say, you joined around about 2012. That's the onset of the Legal Services Act, or Tesco Law as it became known. And you were at Parabis from memory, and leading this slightly different way of delivering the law as a consumer brand almost. From memory, Saga was part of Parabis, wasn't it?
Yeah, no, that's dead right, David. So Parabis was the very first ABS that secured private equity funding on a large scale. And so, yes, we were sort of right at the cutting edge or bleeding edge of legal services reform. And the idea, I think, was, well, without going off into too much of a tangent, a lot of these large insurance companies, including Saga and a few others, they had created a legal services entity partly to get round the referral fee bans that existed then on personal injury work. And the idea was, well, once they created these entities, they could then repurpose them and become law firm brands in their own right. And at that time, and if you recall back to 2011, everyone was getting very excited about the idea of there being Tesco Law, the idea that we'd go from sort of 11,000 separate law firms, a bit like the opticians had done back in the 80s. We'd have 4 big brands that would basically own most of the consumer law that was going on in the UK. And obviously Saga, as you say, was one of those. And we created an ABS for Saga. Saga were advertising legal services very aggressively on TV. And that was very much the aim, to see if we could destroy, if you like, that fragmentation of the consumer law market and build it all around 3 or 4 big brands. I mean, I happen to think that is very, very unlikely ever to happen now, looking back on it. A lot of money, I think, was wasted by private equity and other funds thinking that was going to happen. I think it's not going to happen because this market is just fundamentally different from other retail markets.
You've moved into my next question very neatly. What went well and what went badly? Why didn't it work?
Well, it's a really interesting question. We could do a podcast on this one alone because it's fascinating, and I think there are a number of factors that explain it. Firstly, if you think about legal services, they're really not like other retail products. They're what you might call a distressed purchase. They're not something that you will go out and buy just because you've seen an advert or you've got a demand for it. You do it because an event has happened to you. So you've got divorced, or you've been in an accident, or you're moving house. So that changes the whole economics and the marketing of them. That's point one. I think the bigger point, though, is that let's think about how that consolidation around 4 big brands might have happened. It would have required a household name like Virgin or Saga or Tesco or Marks and Spencers, and we were talking to all of these people at the time, to move into legal services. And the problem with that is, and you and I know this because we've operated in this market long enough, legal services are not easy things to run, and reputationally they create a lot of issues for you. So conveyancing is a classic example, isn't it? You know, conveyancing, we know, is operationally very difficult. It accounts for something like 30% of all complaints about legal services to the Ombudsman. So if you're a big brand and you've got a great brand, are you really going to go into legal services? Is it something that makes a great deal of sense for, I mean, an example I might give is, let's say you're John Lewis or Waitrose, you own the Waitrose brand. You're getting probably 500 quid a month off your best customers for their shopping bill, and over the course of a year that's worth what, £6,000. Are you going to put that at risk to do a conveyancing transaction under the Waitrose brand or the John Lewis brand for a small 100 quid referral fee or something like that? And I think that's the key here, that the running of legal services is not something that is necessarily brand enhancing for companies that already have a good brand. And that's why I think the way this market will shape out is more that you will get people owning, if you like, sort of legal services corporations in each of these main verticals. So conveyancing, you start to see already the big players there. You'll see the same in probate. But I think, rather than them being part of big retail brands, it's more likely that they will be verticals just in this market. I suppose the only thing I would say against that, obviously property companies might end up owning legal service businesses. So that is maybe another way of looking at it.
It's a fascinating subject, as you say, one for another podcast perhaps, but I think you've succinctly suggested some of the reasons why it wasn't quite a success. What were the key learnings that you took away from that experience and have applied to Muve?
I think the really fundamental thing that hit me when I was working with Saga in particular, and having been a lawyer in leading law firms, Allen and Overy, Bird and Bird, Clyde and Co. But what really hit me was the way they approached the retail product, if you like. I mean, this was something completely different. I mean, the average lawyer doesn't look at legal services as a product. They look at it as a service, which it is, but obviously it has product elements. But also when they come to things like customer care, it can be very, very vague, what the commitment is. I mean, even using the term customer is a big ask for a lot of law firms. The idea of a client, and of course client does reflect our professional obligations, but it's also a way of, if you like, insulating yourself from really seeing that person as a customer in the traditional way. And working with Saga seeing how they would document every single instance of that customer's journey from the initial telephone call to how long it took to get a letter out to how long it would take to raise the inquiries. This was something that I thought was interesting and very demanding. It wasn't an easy thing to work with, but I think when we created Muve, we realized we wanted to come at this from very, very high levels of process, very high levels of technology, and that, I think, is, that's a journey we're still on. I mean, we're just recruiting at the moment someone who'll be what we call a chief product officer in our setup, and again, I see that as quite an innovative thing. That's saying, actually, even with all of the process and tech we've already put in place, it doesn't go far enough. We want somebody who's going to really think about what the customer's experience is of interacting with a law firm. So yeah, in answer to your question, that's what I learned, I think, most of all, was that extreme focus on how you document the customer's experience.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast has explored this technology client experience dichotomy a few times. What's your take on it? How do you marry up the fact that this is a property transaction, it's a very personal experience for somebody, but at the same time it needs to be delivered in a technological way in order for process to be efficient?
I think it's a big mistake to think that just coming at it from technology and process will completely resolve all of your customer experience issues, and I think there's a great tendency there, and that's what I would say is this step from, there's lots of firms operating in our sector that are good at technology, they're good at process, and they're quite right, and we're the same. They think, well, if we get that process slicker, then the customer's experience is going to be better. But the customer's experience doesn't reduce to the tech. That's the point. There are lots of non-traditional ways that customers have a good feeling about a service. It can be in the voice that they get from the person on the end, the other end of the line. It can be about how much empathy, how many, all these other things that if you're going to do it right, you can't just see it as a robotic process. You've got to put this layer also of thinking, well, what about all of the, if you like, the more emotional and other aspects of that journey that you're going to have to cover off? The two go hand in hand. That's the point. You can't do one without the other. But I think what we see as an opportunity is to really take it further, because our tech is already quite slick. We think that we've got the main milestones covered. We've got the portal like everyone else, all this sort of stuff. But there's an opportunity to layer on that this additional dimension of being very attuned to the kind of emotional requirements of the customer as well. And I think that's what makes you kind of, that's what good retail service is all about, isn't it? It's that move from just being technically strong to getting the service elements right as well.
I wonder if some people that listen to this podcast will find using the term retail in a conveyancing transaction quite a challenge, because as we've talked about, conveyancing is incredibly fragmented. It's delivered by this whole range of people, and retail isn't really in the vernacular of the lawyer, is it?
No, it isn't. But my contention is that it should be. I think it's, if I look at my own career and people say, well, yeah, I've had this issue. I've had this debate with people and I get accused. You get these very sort of high-minded conveyancers taking issue with the language of retail. But I look back, I mean, I was a professor of law at one point early in my career. I worked in, some of the most demanding law firms, and so if I'm not coming at this by downgrading lawyers and legal services. I'm saying that there is a way of delivering these services in a legally competent and technically strong way. But if you're a good lawyer, whether you're a good commercial lawyer, your attunement to the customer is a kind of integral part of doing that job well. It's not about I think where people get mistaken is they think, well, the language of retail is it's either a dumbing down or it's also a sidestepping of professional standards. It's not. It's saying those things have to be given. You have to do your work to an extremely high standard, technically, professionally. But if you're good at what you do, you're also going to want to make sure that that service is delivered, to the customer satisfaction, that they go away and they feel like they want to recommend your service. I suppose the other thing I would say, David, is that apart from it just being an independently kind of good service value that good lawyers should be concerned about, just like good doctors or anyone else, they want people to, enjoy the interaction that people have with them. But also there is a market point here, isn't there? I mean, the truth is, if you look at price comparison sites, it's sort of what Richard Susskind has called unbundling of legal services. Over the last 25 years, what we have seen is that conveyancing provision has become unbundled from traditional law firm delivery. People buy it as a freestanding commodity. I'm not going to comment on whether that's right or wrong, but that's a fact. They don't think, oh, well, I'll only get my conveyancing from my traditional law firm that can also do my family law work and my other legal work. They think, no, conveyancing is a discrete product, and I'm going to go out and shop for the best combination of price and quality. And that's a fact. People can rail against it, but just look at where our work comes from.
Is the Legal Services Board playing its part in that? Because it is trying to encourage this differentiation of legal services. You're now subject to price transparency rules. What's your view on what is happening there to help consumers understand better what they're buying?
Oddly, given that sort of very strong consumerism that I was kind of spouting a minute ago, interestingly, I would say that, in a way, that the law firms and the market are doing a good job. It seems to me they are doing a good job in terms of improving transparency. As we said a moment ago, you've got things like price comparison sites, which are holding firms. I mean, these are very demanding environments. Can you imagine the big city law firms like Freshfields and Linklaters, Allen & Overy, going on to sites like that where they're being ranked and, they're having to auction their services? That does exist actually in the insurance legal world. I remember being involved in some of those in the past, but these are very demanding things. And I must say, I'm not a great fan. I never have been. I've always been a kind of, I say enemy, but I've never been happy with the regulators. I mean, the CLC I'm kind of okay with in the conveyancing world, but I've never liked the SRA, never liked the Law Society, the LSB, and all these regulators. I feel that over what they've failed to properly estimate the amount of good work that the law firms do to improve their service and become more transparent. And I think anyone, you and I have discussed this in other fora, but the fees for conveyancing, I think we all agree, are very, very competitive. And I think it really is kind of odd to me that regulators and others are putting more downward pressure on fees when the fee levels currently are only barely sustainable. And that to me is a big issue. I'm not saying there should be any kind of organized attempt to increase fees, because of course we are in a retail market and the market will decide the fees. But I think regulators should understand that the fees chart, I mean, I've sometimes given the example when explaining it to customers that we are charging significantly less than, say, they would pay to a plumber on a call-out basis or to their garage when they take their car in for servicing. So why are our regulators putting more and more pressure on something that can only go to a sort of, if you like, that sort of race to the bottom on fees?
I sense your passion, and we'll have to have you back on the podcast to talk about that. I want to move on to technology a little bit, because you guys were recently in the press regarding the first digital remortgage, which you completed with PEXA and Coventry and Hinckley Building Society.
Hinckley and Rugby Building Society.
That feels like a step in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, fascinating. I mean, I think it's probably the most interesting period that I can remember certainly in my involvement with consumer legal services, that in the conveyancing world at the moment, there is a lot going on the tech front, isn't there? And that I think the difference, I think, is that now we're beginning to see some technologies and approaches come along that look like they could really make quite a significant change. Up to this point, you hear a lot of talk, but mostly you think, well, that's unlikely to have an impact. Whereas I think PEXA, a very good example of a company with that incredible track record in Australia. They've revolutionized conveyancing practice in Australia, trying to do the same thing here. And yeah, we were delighted to be involved in that. But the point for us as a firm is, yes, technology, and I must say, we spend a lot of time trying to understand what our proper technology strategy should be. But technology is at the heart of what we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve with reform to conveyancing. The one thing I just mentioned in that, I would say the challenge for law firms is that conveyancing, despite all the talk, the heart of the process is still not very technologically sophisticated. I mean, it's still got a lot of manual, non-digital elements to it. And I think what firms have got to work out is, where do they sit on that? Are they supposed to be competing with external platform providers like PEXA, or should they be focused more on how they interoperate with those platforms? And I think that's critical, because unless you get that thing right, or that decision right, you're going to make some costly mistakes on tech.
So if we had a magic wand, what would the changes that you sort of see that need to be made in the conveyancing process look like?
Yeah, I would say, obviously the frustrations in conveyancing are probably, at heart still to do with the way that the process has these manual dropouts. So the fact that, you are very dependent on the conduct of the other side solicitors, you're very dependent on waiting for information to come back from third parties. So the frustration in trying to run an efficient conveyancing process is the fact that so much of the data that you're dealing with is still in this sort of non-structured, non-digital format, and it limits what you can do. So yeah, magic wand probably would be that we got a lot further down the track in digitizing some of the core information, whether it's leases and management information, that would allow us to simplify the process. And I think, yeah, that's probably where my focus would be. There's an inevitable amount of manual stuff in it, and we accept that, and the lawyers' skill in reviewing documents, that's retained, but it would certainly be good if we could systematize more of the process.
So we're now in 2023. The last 2 years have been crazy, to say the least. There's lots of doom and gloom out there. What are your thoughts and predictions for what the next 12, 18, 24 months looks like for conveyancing?
Well, obviously, end of 2022 was an extremely turbulent and difficult period, and one that made prediction extremely hard, because we had all of these kind of, global macroeconomic trends materializing, but we also had this very distinctive UK gloss from the famous mini budget onwards, and it was very difficult for those of us at that time planning our business plans for 2023 to work out how do we come at it. And I think the way we came at it was probably like most firms. Well, you try and work out what the worst case scenarios are, and see whether you should be taking any action to try and mitigate that. Worst case scenarios, you would say, in this market probably You have to go back to the crashes in the 90s and the global financial crash back in 2008. And I think one of the interesting things when you look at those crashes, the effect on the market, perhaps not as big as people think, so even at the worst of the 2007-2008 global financial crash, you were still looking at sort of 700,000 to 800,000 purchase transactions taking place in the UK or in England and Wales. So, our view has always been quite bullish about keeping our capacity strong and focusing on growing our market share, because as we, as you know, and people who look at this market will say it's a very fragmented market. The top 5 or 6 law firms only have about 5 or 6% of the market. So there's always more market to go after. And I think that's been our approach. In terms of the outlook, I mean, my own take is that obviously we began to see at the end of 2022 certain factors improving, like the swap rates coming down in the mortgage market, probably the pressures on inflation subsiding a little bit. So I think what we're all hoping for, I think the first half of 2023 is going to stay very tough, but hopefully a return to something more like pre-COVID levels of business from the second half of 2023, and that's the basis on which we're going forward.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
I think it's fair to say that 2023 is going to be an interesting year. I'm not going to say much more than that. I'm certainly not going to make any predictions. David, it's been fantastic to have you on the podcast. Thanks so much for joining.
Thank you so much, David. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for inviting me.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to David. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.